Thank you so much, Kim. It's amazing to hear everything that's happening in Quebec and all of the movement that yourself and the communities you're a part of have spurred. But the question was just, what does Équiterre do, and can you explain that?
Yeah, Équiterre is one of the main groups. The main groups that were in that at that time were Équiterre, were Greenpeace was there also, AQLPA was there also. But the strategy that we used for the shale gas was not to have only one group being targeted, because then it's too easy. So the list I gave you is actually the best way to do it. Everybody was giving was putting its share in it. And one of the success is definitely the citizens group with the help of the environmental group, Équiterre being one, but there was many others. Because you feed the citizens group, and they feed you also with the experience. But the government and the industry hate citizens group, fear citizens group, because it's hard to catch, and it's hard to, what do you want to do with them? You cannot do anything, so it's very good. The more citizens group that you have, the best it is. And I'm sure it's the same in New Brunswick.
The only comment I would make on that is that there were, just briefly, there were several points in Kim's presentation that I sort of wished I'd touched on. One is the broad coalition. We also had, if we had had a PowerPoint and I had put them up there, you would have seen that almost all the sectors were represented here. We had the nurses, and we had youth organizations, student organizations, and we had all different kinds of people or organizations participating. The 95% I thought was interesting. Again, there's a parallel there, because we actually did a survey in Kent County in order to bring our regional service board on our side to push for an end to the testing and a moratorium in Kent County. And we came up with 90 to 95% of the people in the area. So, and the argument about the no moratorium, that's what they told us when both the medical officer of health and Louis Lapierre, the fraudulent consultant that was hired to go around and pretend that he was doing an evaluation of whether shale gas should happen. Both of them were given instructions by the provincial government that they were not to discuss a moratorium, that was not within their frame of reference for their reports. So, so I thought those things were very interesting in your presentation, and I'm glad you brought them up.
Actually, yesterday, I don't know if you saw the news yesterday, but they were looking for oil, because in Quebec is not a gas province. It's really a province that no oil, but we're not that into gas, really. So they found out yesterday that 70% of the reserves would be gas, natural gas, and shale gas. And mostly the Ministry of Natural Resources said yesterday, we're not deciding anything yet. We have to see, we have to look, we have to, as usual. But we don't know. But Anticosti is a whole different game, but it's full of shipwrecked around the island. So we're not that worried.
The politicians work hard to get elected, and it costs a lot of money to get elected. They get that money primarily from wealthy people and companies, not from ordinary people. One of the things that was interesting about the fracking situation or the panel review process was the high level of analysis that came to the panel. Now, one of the reasons I agreed to go on the panel was the way they got citizen input. It wasn't just with public meetings. It was through the website. So you could put your comments on the website and they would be posted and anybody else could comment on them. When people on the committee and the panel produced chapters for it, those chapters, after a few revisions within the panel, then went on the website and people could comment on them, and the authors were supposed to take those comments and blend them together. The quality of the work done around the province was very, very high, so high that it was threatening to some members of the panel. And I think some members of the panel and the industry were totally taken aback by the quality of the work and the rate at which it got spread around. Now, the interesting thing is we had this Ivany study the year before our panel sessions were held, and the Ivany Commission did some survey work. And this is before fracking had really become a hot topic in Nova Scotia. And one of the questions was, do you think the environment trumps jobs? And a very high percentage, I've forgotten, is something like 72% of the people said yes. Second thing about that study was, if you compared the answers between rural areas of Nova Scotia and the urban areas have low unemployment, high wages, etc. The rural areas had almost as high a response as the urban areas. In other words, people who desperately needed the job and still said no, the environment trumps. So I think what's going on is the politicians are in a real quandary, and I don't feel sorry for them, because the people who are helping to fund their campaigns don't have nearly the number of votes of the people who were informed, A, about the environment, and B, quickly became informed about fracking as a particular environmental issue. So I think you've got some politicians who, as in cases cited on this panel, have said, no, we're in favor of a moratorium. But may I quote Frank McKenna when he addressed in 2014 after our report had come out. He addressed a conference where he called the fact that the politicians in Nova Scotia had put on a soft ban on fracking, he called it mob rule. I find it very interesting that a politician who presumably believes in democracy would call that existing politicians serving their constituents' wishes mob rule.
But just to answer also from the rural local politician, everyone in the room, imagine that you're a town councillor of a city, of a small community of 700 people, 1,000 people. You know that there's something huge that is coming. There's two ways of reacting to it. One is to get into it, but you don't really know how to do it. One is to say it won't exist, and these people are just, they don't know what they're talking about. The government is saying that everything's fine. And I think that this played too. But once they know more about it, and then you probably have the same thing in your provinces, but we have these politicians association. Once it gets into that, then in one way it's easier. But if the citizens are not there and the other pressure groups are not there, they will go into the dogma, which is that energy pays whatever the energy, especially the fossil fuel energy.
The situation on the royalties is the same here in New Brunswick, although it happened in two stages. The first round of discussion about how this was going to benefit us all, I forget the numbers now, but they were talking maybe 10% or something like that, and it was going to start after the first year. It was something like that. And then after the fraudulent Louis Lapierre report, recommendations were adopted, the royalty rate dropped to, I think, 4% in the third year or something like that. And so it's in the same situation as what Michael was talking about. It's very hard to imagine what the argument is for it when you're looking at that kind of return. And yes, as Michael said, the most productive year for that kind of unconventional fracking is the first year, and after that, there's really the production really drops off markedly. So. The other thing was the comment around the number of people who value the environment. There was a survey released about a year and a half or 2 years ago before the moratorium was enacted. There were a number of surveys, and they kept trying to do the surveys over and over again in order to prove their point, and it never worked out for them. But there was one survey that I remember in particular. I'm going to guess it was the middle of 2012. in which the population was divided, 45%, on whether they thought fracking was a good idea. Most people didn't really know that much, but some thought it was an okay idea, others thought it probably wasn't. But 83% of the people said that they were concerned about the environment. And every time they did the surveys, they'd come up with the same numbers. So what I guess what I'm hearing here is that, or what I'm trying to convey is that what we're talking about is the same right across the Maritimes, and they must all be taking lessons from each other and not learning much.
Just to make sure that people listening online can hear these questions, we're going to get people to speak into this mic.
Just a note, Hermann Scheer, who is the father of the green energy revolution in Germany, when he was asked the same question about how politicians in North America are not moving forward with the huge job opportunities of the clean economy, he put it down to what he referred to as organized, legalized corruption. And he said that the power and money and influence of oil and gas has essentially captured North America. And so that's an interesting observation. He passed away a couple of years ago, but certainly very interesting legacy. My question is one about the independence of the commission here we have in New Brunswick. And the question is for Michael. It's been just over a year since we've toppled the Conservative government. We have a moratorium in place, and I really hate to see yet another commission here in New Brunswick. We have a memory hole, we have amnesia practiced by our politicians. We do not need another shale gas commission right now. What we need is a clean economy and local prosperity commission. That's what we should be asking for. We should be having public meetings in this province on that and not wasting our time with this shale gas commission. So my question is, your observations in Nova Scotia, did you see a reluctance to look at all of the science? Did you see some cherry picking of information, preference on industry data versus scientific and even government data collected in shale gas states? Very compelling in terms of well integrity failure rates. Just your observations about what you saw on the practice of the Nova Scotia Commission.
Yes. There was cherry picking of the evidence, and what you had, I felt, was sort of a huge blind spot. They kept arguing that the only real evidence we could accept would be peer-reviewed academic journal articles. So in the middle of our hearings, the local paper carried a picture of two fracking trucks, one going in opposite directions, having an accident in the middle of a little town, despite the fact that the police had cordoned off the roads so these trucks could go by safely. That wasn't evidence, because it wasn't peer-reviewed academic stuff. Academics got up at some of our public meetings. I'm thinking the one at King's in Halifax, and then subsequently published a comment. Tom Duck, who's an atmospheric scientist, published an article criticizing the way the statements, the audience was being handled to kind of stifle some of the stuff. And so I circulated that around the committee, sent out an email with it around the committee, and the question was, why are you sending us this? He's not a geologist. I said, no, but he's an atmospheric scientist, and we're worried about methane getting up into the atmosphere. So that they had this blind spot that unless it was academic, in an academic peer-reviewed journal, we really shouldn't consider it. And of course, those people sending stuff into us weren't academics. So you could have said the sky is blue today, and well, what's the journal reference for that? And that was, to my mind, a very serious situation. I pointed out to them that, what's his name, Adolf Wagner, who published in the early 20s or mid-20s an article, or excuse me, he gave a paper to a geology conference, he was a geologist, on what is now known as plate tectonics. He gave a paper on this. He was laughed out of that particular conference, and he was excluded from the academic journals. And I said to them, if you ask my 12-year-old grandson, he can now explain to you what plate tectonics is, but for 20 years, until Tuzo Wilson came along and said, hey, I've got evidence that supports Wagner, he couldn't get published in the journals. So to say we only will accept stuff from the journals, where the people who get the most massive pile of data, and of course data piles are important, they get it from the industry. So as I said in my comments, I hope, we need independent sources of data and lots of it, but the journals have been publishing stuff which is using industry data almost totally in terms of things like jobs and the industry apparently has known some things about, for instance, well integrity, which they don't want to get out, of course, so that when Howarth and his research team published an article about the fact that Kim mentioned methane leakage at the production site and as opposed to the consumption, his article said, but let's look at the distribution. And there's huge leakage of methane in the distribution system. So he said, when you add up all that methane and the fact that methane is something like 15 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of being a greenhouse gas, then it is not a green energy source. And that was not welcome news for our panel. They tended to be quite dismissive of anybody. Well, one of the panelists said, oh, he's just new. Well, gee, often it's the young, new academics who are on the edges of the frontier that are doing the prime work. The fact that he's new is irrelevant. But they always had a reason for dismissing things that they didn't want. I, however, considered everything.
Here are from the Moncton and Riverview area. I live in Hillsborough, and so we are in the middle of a shale gas area. I don't know how many people in Riverview realize that the shale gas runs from Hillsborough down in back of us all the way. It's the same formation as in Penobscot. So it is all around us here, and it's not just in Kent County. But what it has done, and the unification and the sharing of information, Quebec, we had a gentleman come from Quebec to teach us in peaceful confrontations, or peaceful, what's the terminology? Thank you. Peaceful civil disobedience, and to share what was going on in Quebec. So that came down here. Mike Bradford, I'm delighted to see you because I've used your material over and over again because he made economics really easy to understand and gave us good information. Anne and all the work that she's done in Kent County and all the gang in Kent County, we've all shared information, and that has made a huge difference in what we've been able to do here in New Brunswick. And that's the good thing about shale gas, is that it has made us all realize what is so vitally important to us, and that our relationships are so important, and that sharing of expertise. And it's given us more authenticity. And it has made the industry sit up and say, these are people that we have to contend with. And I saw a video of Elizabeth May when she was 23 years old, and she said when they start attacking and attacking me personally, then they have nothing else to stand on. And I mean, we've been called NIMBYs and bananas and eco-terrorists and special interest groups. And I think if we are a special interest group, what are those guys in industry? right? But anyway, I didn't have a question, but I just wanted to say, thank you to all of you and to everybody who has had something to do with bringing us all together.
Shale gas bringing us together.
Can I comment on that? No. Your comment about the special interest group. I used to have a cartoon on my office door which showed two businessmen complaining about people out picketing with Save the Planet. And the guy said, another one-issue group.
I had the opportunity last winter to go around Southern Ontario and Montreal, 5 different stops, and talk about the Abjumali Aptasikdowaskikumu legal challenge that was just beginning to form up, and ask people to share the information about it and get involved in supporting if they could. And everywhere I went, people found the story of the unity that we have been building here really inspiring. They would come up to me afterwards and say, thank you for telling that story, because we don't see that here. We haven't seen that here, and that's just amazing what you're doing there. And so I just wanted to give a couple of quick examples of what we have seen here, because I know that our brothers and sisters on the West Coast are trying to decode how we've pulled this off, so that they can get a moratorium over there. One example would be the famous time when, I'm not going to implicate anybody but me in this, but the famous time when the trucks were barricaded into the land owned by Irving. Now, they made a big mistake there. Again, they underestimated us, because there was only one way in and out of that piece of land for those trucks, so it was pretty much a no-brainer that somebody might go by there and plant a vehicle right in front of the gate, and that's exactly what happened. As soon as the trucks were in there, more or less, the fracking trucks, the seismic trucks were in there, the thumpers, somebody went and put a vehicle right in front of the gate so they couldn't get their trucks out. And within 3 hours, there was a call to the leadership of our different organizations in the county, the community leaders, to go to a meeting at a community hall and discuss this. And we came out united that we were going to support it. And it didn't matter who did it, and it didn't matter who was at the meeting, but we were all there, all the 3 founding peoples and the newcomers like myself and other people who have been active. There was a dozen of us there. I can't remember the names of any of the others. And we just said, yeah, sure, that makes sense. We're keeping them in there. And it lasted for 3 weeks. Another example, much more recently, is when the Fracking Commission came to Kent County, and they asked, they had sort of handpicked a few people with some insight from other individuals in the anti-fracking movement. They had handpicked some key people from the community organizations in our district, in Signuktuk, to meet with about the concerns that they had around social license. They wanted to talk to us about that and other things on their 5-point conditions. And I took a look at it and I said, well, why are you only meeting with the Acadians and the Anglos? Why aren't the Mi'kmaq invited? Because we don't do things without them. We're all in this together. We're all united. And anyways, as it turned out, of course, these things have to go through a process, and everybody had to get in on it, and everybody had to reflect on what made sense. So in the end, we did all go together. I wasn't personally there because I was actually in Ontario, and I was fighting this battle out by email, but the Mi'kmaq decided that they would come but that they would only come as observers so that it wouldn't be seen as some sort of fake version of free, prior, and informed consultation, consent. So, but it made the point that we cannot be divided anymore. We are united.
I have a comment. When they were talking about the free trade agreement back in 1988, something that popped up was water exports. It was kind of a hidden agenda, and there's a woman from BC, Wendy Holmes, she exposed the fine print in the free trade agreement that water was going to be a big moneymaker for certain people. And after the free trade election, I went and I did my own research as to who was pushing this and what they were saying. And they had great concerns about the environmental movement back in before the free trade agreement came in. And so it was their work that with free trade agreement, we would be exporting our manufacturing sectors, and we would be totally dependent on resources. So that's what happened. People remember 1990, all the jobs leaving the country, and now resources are all we have. This can be reversed. Another thing they're doing is they're mounting the Canadian debt and say, oh, look, we're really in debt. We have to do whatever's offered on the table. And part of reversing the debt that they're building up is the movement by Comer, Committee on Economic, Monetary and Economic Reform. They hired Rocco Galati, a constitutional lawyer, and they're going to Supreme Court to fight the government's way of financing public debt. Long time ago, we used to use the Bank of Canada to finance public debt. In 1974, they stopped doing that, and if you look at statistics, that's when the Canadian debt starts climbing. And that's making its way to the Supreme Court. They've been at it for 4 years now, and just about nothing's in the public media about it. The more we can support that, that's a better chance to reverse the national debt that we're building. And because they're going to use it as a club. You have to accept whatever we offer because you're in debt. Okay, that's my own comment. Thank you.
Okay, I'll react to that one. Yes, you're right. Comer's got that thing going, and it's important. I think your comments about the 1988 election are right. The original NAFTA, Canada-U.S. trade agreement is like all the other agreements that have been negotiated for the last 30 years, and that is they are not about free trade, because they often increase the patent protection, for instance, for the drug industry, which is a way of preventing competition, and free trade is supposed to be about encouraging competition, so that they're really investor protection programs. And of course, one of the most egregious part of them is that they allow foreign companies to sue the Canadian government if we introduce, say, environmental or health or other legislation, labor legislation, whatever kind of legislation, which affects their profits. So that it's protecting the investors and taking governance away from our elected parliaments and away from our judicial system and putting them into what are essentially kangaroo courts run by the businesses for the businesses. So one would hope that the latest TPP will not get accepted. The other thing to say is that when in the 60s, when Canada was a thriving country, the Bank of Canada held 25% of the government debt and foreigners held 5%. By 1990, those percentages, or maybe it was slightly earlier, John Dillon and I were in an airport in Labrador talking about this at the time. I hadn't noticed the data, but John brought my attention to it. The percentages were reversed, and 25% of our debt was held outside of Canada, and only 5% was held by the Bank of Canada. For those of you who want to know the importance of all this, debt held by the Bank of Canada is essentially free because the bank is not allowed to make a profit. So the interest that it makes on holding Canadian government bonds goes back to the government. So it's essentially interest-free debt.
I'm just going to mention that if Irving would pay taxes, his taxes, New Brunswick wouldn't be hard up, and you know, takes all his money. I heard he takes all his money to the Bahamas, where his father set up a tax haven. And so Bermuda, sorry. And guess who paid Louis Lapierre? Irving paid him. And I mean, who would have benefited from shale gas? Irving was to be the main distributor here for shale gas. Who will benefit from the pipeline? Irving is wants to set up a refinery where he can ship the oil all over the place, every other country and everything. And he just takes a liberty wherever he wants. And nobody says anything. It's like, I'm shocked that people are even afraid to say his name. So that's the big problem here.
I'm with you on that, Alma, and thank you for mentioning the fact that they don't pay taxes. It was on my list, and I just missed it when I was going down the list of media control and all the other ways in which we're a captured state thanks to Irving. So thank you.
Wow. But talking about Irving, Will, one of the main arguments against shale gas and against all hydrocarbons is that when there's an accident, it stays there forever. And I was telling Mike and his Will and earlier, the Irving well that everybody knows here, the accident was about in 73. It was in the ocean, but still. You know that in Île-de-la-Madeleine, every year they're still finding bags full of BPC and oil from that time. Exxon Valdez is still a problem, and that's at least 20 years ago. Close to Montreal, there was something with the hydrocarbons in a landfill. It happened for 3 months. They still don't have fresh water. That won't happen with solar panel. It won't happen with wind turbines. It doesn't happen with biogas. With energy efficiency, there's really no problem there. So that's one other big argument. So when we're talking about risk, we have to think also about the length of the consequence in the risk thing.
He was also considering to be the distributor of fresh water at the same time when he was talking about being a distributor for gas. He was also going to be selling water, selling us our own water.
All right, we're going to take one final question.
Yeah, I had one question for Michael. The Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement compared to the NAFTA agreement. Now, will NAFTA, the agreement they've made and the penalties that we will have under NAFTA, which is worse? What do you give us your prediction between NAFTA and the Pacific Trade Agreement, which I've been following?
Which is worse? I'll cut off your right hand or your right foot. As I understand it, and I must confess I'm too worn out to try to delve it further into this. Council of Canadians will do that for me. As I understand it, the worst of the NAFTA penalties and so on for trying to protect your environment or whatever, if they are more severe than what's in TPP, they stand. In other words, we get the worst of any of the bargains we've made. That's That's what I read in the paper. I have not looked at it myself at all. There's enough things that make me throw beer bottles at the news.
I was at the Council of Canadians annual general meeting last weekend. It was a wonderful thing. I recommend everybody join and go to their meetings because it was just like the most invigorating, most positive, most best learning experience, that kind of thing. Anyway, there was a guy there whose name is Gus Van Harten, who is an expert on these agreements, and he can talk about them, and actually somebody who's dumb like me, who doesn't know anything about this stuff, can grasp what they're talking about. And he talked about the different agreements, and I have a couple pages of notes, and I guess I'd like to tell you all, but I can't tell you. But he just recently wrote a book about the agreement with the Chinese, or the way in which agreements like that are working out with the Asians. But one thing that he said, which I thought was really interesting, and I think this guy really knows his stuff, he said, if there's a climate change agreement from the UN, it would supersede, the targets that are set for that would supersede, I'm looking at Mark and Carolyn just to make sure I got this right, but they would supersede the trade agreements, these regional trade agreements. So it wouldn't matter if, say, somebody had access to this or that, and that was going to pollute, and that was going to create this problem and that problem with the climate. If there's a global climate change agreement coming out of Paris, then that sets targets, then the other agreements would, by virtue of international law, have to comply with those. Is that what you got from it? Yes, only if Canada ratified the agreement, yes. Yeah. Anyway, he had a number of other simple tips, so if you're interested in more information on the trade agreements, you can go on the Council of Canadians website and go into that area, and the points that he brought up are made there.
So it is very nearly 9:30. In the interest of not keeping us too late, I think we'll wrap up the questions. Do any of the panelists have a final word for us, or any burning comments that you want to make? Yeah.
Just one comment from talking with Kim earlier today, and the recent question about how long things have to be done. Once a well is dug and finished in terms of profitability, it's capped, but there has to be continuous monitoring to infinity to make sure that the well cement that seals it doesn't break down. And most of us, when you go down the basement, even though it's not our own territory, you can see places where the cement is beginning to wear, and that's on the inside, so that it's a very serious proposition in terms of expense and danger. That the corporations, of course, have a very short-term profit horizon. The politicians maybe have a 4-year and 8-year election cycle. Geology has millions of years. The climate has a long life cycle, and we are talking about putting something in place that may break down in 50 years or 150 years. One of the submissions to our panel was pointing out that in just outside of Halifax and Fall River, they are now having problem with arsenic, which comes from gold mining 100 years before. So that we've got a serious problem with the integrity of the wells that are capped. But Kim tells me, and we don't know if this is restricted to Quebec, in Quebec and perhaps other provinces, once the wells are capped, that essentially seals the liability of the corporations, and it's the government that has to pick up the liability from then on.
Good. Any other comments? All right.
There's also, I've read all of the Michael Binion's from Quester's blog yesterday while being at the airport waiting to come here. And one of the comments, he said is that they're really reliable and there's no problem, and they've got very high qualified employees. But I don't know how much you realize that when you're drilling, for example, a company from Questea, but it could be another one, Corridor Resource or anyway, they're drilling, they're asking another company as subcontractor to come. Then the insurance is not anymore there because they can say it's this subcontractor. But this subcontractor is also hiring other people. So then the insurance track is the responsibility track is gone. So guess who will be stuck with the crisis after? The government, us again.
The taxpayer.
It's really, no, but it's really nice. We've got gifts like that all the time. And one last thing. Do you know also that gas travels through in pipes, but it also travels along pipes? Yeah. That means that if there's a leak and you have a barn and there's a simple line for water or anything, it will follow the line of water and it will appear in the barn, for example. In Trois-Rivières, there was this, and I don't know, I think it's in 2005, it happened with, there was a storage place, and what happened is that the gas escaped and it went into a neighborhood. It killed 5 people and it all burned. That can happen, and it can happen anywhere because gas follows the lines. So all these things, do we need that? I mean, it has to be put in the balance, even though the company will tell you that it's really not risky.
Any last comments, Anne?
No.
Nope. All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight. Let's give one last big round of applause for our panelists.